All right, guys, welcome back. This is our last lesson on the Renaissance. And again, I want to reiterate the Renaissance is kind of a weird time period to define. It's over almost 300 years long from some of these people that we're talking about. Also, a lot of people think that the Renaissance, the entirety of Europe, is having this huge growth in learning and art and all sorts of other things, but it actually wasn't. Lots of Europe was actually doing worse than during medieval times. So it's really some wealthy cities like we talked about, like Florence and Rome and some others that are seeing this explosion in art and music and all sorts of other things. So let's look at last time we talked about the Italian Renaissance. This time I'm going to talk about other people outside of Italy, for instance, from places like Germany, Belgium, and England. This week's vocabulary words, or this lesson's vocabulary words, are William Shakespeare, Elizabethan age, Johannes Gutenberg, printing press, and vernacular. Go ahead and take notes, or you can just listen and follow along. First of all, we're going to start with someone named William Shakespeare. You've probably heard that name, William Shakespeare, before. He is probably the most prolific and well-known writer of all times. He's written several plays, poems, sonnets, all sorts of stuff. Things that you've probably heard of, like Hamlet, Romeo and Juliet, Macbeth, and people still pay lots of money to see these shows performed. There's also lots of movies made after his writing still today. In fact, his writing still influences a lot of what you might see today in movies. If you ever see a movie where two people fall in love and they're from different families that aren't supposed to be together, and they can't be together because their families don't like each other or they're from different places, well, that's just Romeo and Juliet being redone. So William Shakespeare, again, probably the most important, most prolific writer of all times. Now here's our second vocabulary word, the Elizabethan age. The Elizabethan age was a little bit later than the Renaissance. It's kind of in the same time, but again, when we talk about the Renaissance, it's this huge stretch of time. So it's a little bit later than where we talked about the Italian Renaissance, and it was named the Elizabethan age after Queen Elizabeth, and she was really into the arts and fostering the arts, and she really backed William Shakespeare and others, and liked to present the arts to people and shows and things like that. So in the Elizabethan age, one of the things that you can really see that categorizes that is how people dressed. And if you look at William Shakespeare here on the left with the big high collar and the frills and the fancy jacket, and he would have been wearing tights and things like that, those are some things that would characterize the way people would dress in the Elizabethan age. All right, let's move on to Germany and a man named Albrecht Dürer. Albrecht Dürer was known for his woodcuts, and woodcuts are kind of what they would sound like. They would take a piece of wood and carve a scene in, for instance, this scene, the Four Horsemen, into the piece of wood. And when they were done carving it into the wood, they would then put ink onto that carving and then transfer the ink, and it would be like a stamp, onto a piece of paper. The next person that we're going to talk about is my favorite, and I'll tell you why. His name was Jan van Eyck. The details that he is doing in these paintings, to me, is really incredible. You have to remember, during this time, there's no electricity, so you're either painting during the daytime, or if it's dark where you're painting, you're doing it by candlelight. They have to make their own paints. They have to make their own canvases and everything, so it's not... Painting itself isn't necessarily the easiest thing in the world to do. But Jan van Eyck, to me, has some of the most incredible details in any of the artwork that we've seen. So that's a self-portrait of him on the left with his head wrap on. And again, and I think I said this in the last videos, it's really hard to make fabric look like fabric when you draw it or when you sculpt it. And it looks really like a piece of red cloth on his head. And then the painting to the painting to the right. And we're going to look at some more details of that right now. So if you notice the painting now, it's on the left. and it's a painting of a wedding scene. There's a lot of symbolism in this wedding scene, and there would have been a lot of symbolism in paintings during that time. Some of the things that you could look for is, if you ever see smoke or candle in a painting during this time, it signifies the presence of God or the Holy Spirit. Down here, you can see how there's one candle, so that would have been that representation of that. In this case, this is a marriage scene. We have a dog down here. It's pretty incredibly painted, but the dog would be a symbol of loyalty, right? Dogs are loyal, and that might have been placed in the painting as a symbol of loyalty. Also, another thing, these oranges, if you look here, these are the oranges. And if you look out the window, you can see, and I'll show you in a minute when you get close up, you can see these are orange trees. In Europe, especially, during this time, having orange trees would be really hard to do. They don't really grow. Citrus doesn't grow in Europe. So this would be a symbol of status, of how much money that you had. Let's look at some of these details. This is the mirror behind them. And if you notice in the mirror, it has their backs, and then it has people standing in front of them. And each little circle here is another little detailed painting. If we look at the brush, it looks like a very realistic brush. And the bed itself, you can see all these incredible details in the bed. These beads, these glass beads, really do look realistic, like glass beads. And this brass chandelier looks shiny and absolutely real. So I want to show you, and you'll have a link to this, how incredible this is and how much you can zoom in and just see the detail. Again, here's the mirror in the back. Pretty incredible. The folds on the lace of her headscarf or her veil. The fur on her dress. So all these things are just, all the detail put in here is just incredible. Let me come down to the dog. If any one element of this painting was on its own, it would be an incredible painting. All right, now for what I think is one of the most important inventions of all time, the printing press. The printing press was invented by Johannes Gutenberg. What the printing press was it took the ideas of China's movable type print. If you remember, that was where you would take different little characters or different letters, rearrange them, stamp them in ink, and then transfer them to paper. Johannes Gutenberg took that idea and put it into a press where you could transfer those stamps to page after page after page after page fairly quickly. How quickly? Well, you could produce 500 Bibles in the same amount of time it would take you to handwrite one. That is a huge increase. What that did was it increased the amount of information that could be given out throughout Europe. Also, what happened were Bibles or other things being printed would be printed in vernacular. Vernacular is the language of an area. So if you're printing Bibles, traditionally, Bibles were all written in Latin. So you had to be able to read Latin in order to read the Bible. Well, now Bibles could be printed in German, English, Spanish, French, whatever language they need to be printed in, they could be printed in that vernacular, and they could be done relatively quickly. I equate the invention of the printing press to the invention of the internet. Before the internet, I had to ride my bike to the library to learn when Abraham Lincoln was born and any other type of information. Now that the internet's out, and especially that the internet's in my phone, you ask me any question, I can just Google search it and tell you the answer. Now, it puts a ton of information at our fingertips, the internet does. And the printing press did kind of the same thing. You could write a book, you could reproduce the Bible, you could pass out information really quickly for that time period by using the printing press. Well, that's it for this lesson. That was a quick one. We'll see you next time.